LAPD is looking for a man named Charles Walden. Charles is a 70-year-old who lives in Sherman Oaks, and I've actually seen this man in over a year. But there's a woman named Caroline who keeps telling everybody Charles is fine. She said he's not missing, he's just not home. At one point, she said he was down in Carpinteria. Then Detective Mark O'Donnell gets involved. He starts actually trying to find Charles. He calls Caroline. She gives him a number to Charles. The number doesn't work. So O'Donnell tells her, look, I need a worker number and I need an address for this man, or I'm going to open a missing person case. The next day, Caroline calls him back, and now all of a sudden she's with Charles. She put this older man on the phone who said he was Charles. The man tells O'Donnell he's staying with some friends in Simi Valley. O'Donnell starts asking him questions. What's your social security card number? Can't give it to him. What's your driver license number? He can't give him that either. So O'Donnell goes to the address in Simi Valley the man just gave him. Charles ain't there. The man who actually lived there said he knows Charles, but he haven't seen him in years. So now O'Donnell knows somebody just got on the phone and lied to him about being Charles Walden. The next day he goes to Caroline's apartment. And while he's sitting there talking to her, he notices a receipt on the coffee table from a cell phone store. He looks at it. The phone had just been bought 2 days earlier. Then he sees the number. It's the same damn number the fake Charles just gave him. So now O'Donnell's trying to figure out why somebody is pretending to be this man, and why the phone they're using leads back to Caroline. But what he doesn't know yet, Charles ain't missing. Charles is dead, and he's been dead for over a year.
What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Top at LA. Hope you're enjoying the new content and the new direction of the channel. I appreciate everybody who's been watching, commenting, and supporting the videos. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and stick around. We got more stories. Come on, y'all, let's get back into it.
Charles Walden had been living in the same house on Kingswood Road in Sherman Oaks since he was a kid. His family moved there back in the 60s. Charles' father died when he was young, and for years it was just Charles and his mother June living in the house together. In 2017, June died. After that, Charles was pretty much by himself. Charles was already the type of person who liked to stay to himself. He wasn't really social. He didn't hang with a bunch of people. The neighbors knew him, but they didn't know him like that. They offered Charles help from time to time. He always would deny him. He liked to do his own thing. And after his mother died, he became more isolated. But Charles had money. He owned his house in Sherman Oaks. He had bank accounts, brokerage accounts, retirement accounts. So even though Charles lived a pretty simple life, mostly stayed to himself, he had millions of dollars in assets. 2020 comes around, COVID hit, and Charles starts putting signs around his property saying he had COVID, telling people to stay away. Now, for somebody who already didn't like to be around a lot of people, this is just another excuse to keep people away from his house. And sometime during the summer of 2020, this dude named Matthew Jason Croth comes across Charles' property. They called him Speedy. Speedy wasn't somebody Charles knew. He was looking for a house to break into. He would go through wealthy neighborhoods looking for properties that looked like they might be empty or somebody wasn't really paying attention. He called what he did urban exploring, but basically it was burglarizing houses, and Charles' house became one of them. Speedy breaks in, and this first time he goes in, Charles is still alive. Speedy steals some jewelry and other stuff out of the house and leaves. Then sometime later he comes back, same house, he gets inside again. Only now Charles is dead. His body is inside the house and it's already decomposing. And just to be clear, nobody knows how Charles died. Investigators were never able to determine that. So I'm not going to sit here and tell y'all Charles was murdered, because we don't know that. All we know is the first time Speedy broke into the house, Charles was alive. And when he came back, Charles was dead. And Speedy doesn't call the police. He doesn't call 911. He started going through Charles' stuff again. He takes more jewelry. He takes Charles' mail. He takes financial information. And while he's going through his stuff, he realized Charles has money. Not just a couple of dollars sitting in the bank either. There was properties, there's estates, and now Speedy knows the man who owns all of it is laying dead inside the house. Speedy calls somebody he knows, Caroline Herring. Speedy knew Caroline before any of this happened. He knew Caroline would know what to do with the financial information he found. Caroline gets involved. Neither one of them reports Charles' death. They don't tell the police. They don't tell anybody Charles is dead. Instead, they started looking at what the man owned and figure out how to get their hands on it. And for that to work, everybody else needed to keep thinking Charles was still alive. So now you got Charles inside the house dead. and Speedy and Caroline know it. But everybody else, as far as they know, Charles is still alive. And that's exactly how Caroline and Speedy needed to stay. Because you can't just walk into somebody's bank and tell them the owner died and then start taking their money. They needed something that made it look like they had the right to handle Charles' business. So that's where the paperwork comes in. Documents were created, making it look like Charles had signed over control of his property and finances. There was a trust, there was a power of attorney document, and there was paperwork connected to Charles' mother, June, who had already been dead since 2017. The signatures wasn't real. Charles hadn't given Caroline control over shit, but on paper, that's what they were making it look like. And once they had the paperwork, money started moving. Between November of 2020 and March of 2022, nearly $600,000 was moved from an account connected to June Wilding into a fake trust account Caroline had set up, and Speedy's name was on one of those accounts with her. At the same time, Caroline started taking control over Charles' house. She started showing up over there. Other people were coming around, dumpsters were brought in, stuff was being taken out of the house, work was being done on the property, and that's when people living around Charles started paying more attention. Because like I told you earlier, Charles stayed to himself, so nobody expected to see him outside every day. But now they weren't seeing him at all. Instead, they're seeing Caroline and all these other people around his house. So when people started asking where Charles was, Caroline already had a story. She said Charles was fine. He had moved down to Carpinteria for a while and was staying at a beach house while work was being done on his property. She also told people she was a trustee handling Charles' affairs, and she even sent letters around the neighborhood explaining why Charles wasn't there. But at least one neighbor wasn't buying it. By December of 2020, somebody called the police and asked them to check on Charles. LAPD came out to the house. Caroline is there. She getting the same story. Charles is in Carpentina. She's a trustee. She handled things for him. The officers still go through the house looking for Charles. He's not there. Adult Protective Service get involved too, and this is where they take it another step. A caseworker eventually gets somebody on the phone who says he's Charles. And whoever this man was, he tells them the same thing Caroline had been saying. He's fine, he's in Carpentina. So the Adult Protective Services closed the case in January of 2021, and that bought them more time, because now it wasn't just Caroline saying Charles was alive. Somebody actually got on the phone with him and pretended to be him. Meanwhile, they're still using Charles' identity. They're still dealing with his property. They're still moving money. But there's one thing they can't fake with paperwork or a phone call. Charles' body is still there. And sooner or later, they got to do something with it. At some point, his body was moved from Sherman Oaks over to Caroline's apartment in West Los Angeles. And Caroline's plan was to dissolve it. She bought acid and lye, gloves, protective equipment, a cadaver bag. She even bought corpse smell deodorizer. Then Charles' body was taken to the rooftop balcony of Caroline's apartment and put into a container with the chemicals. And they left it there for about a week. During that time, the mixture was stirred with a wooden bat, but it didn't work. The chemical wasn't breaking down the body enough to get rid of it. And this part comes from what Caroline later told investigators about what they did. She said Charles' body was taken out of the container and the liquid was drained off. Then they decided to dismember it. Charles' body was cut into pieces small enough to package. His remains was put into a bag and vacuum sealed. And it went further than that. His teeth and bones were crushed to make it harder to identify him if the remains were ever found. Once they had everything packaged, Charles' remains was loaded up and taken out of Los Angeles. They drove all the way up to the Bay Area. Somebody involved in the scheme had a sailboat. They got on the boat, they went into San Francisco Bay and dumped Charles' remains into the water. And that's where they left him. And while all this is happening, everybody else thinks Charles is alive. He's in Carpinteria. He's staying somewhere else. He's talking on the phone with people. Meanwhile, his actual remains are sitting somewhere on the bottom of San Francisco Bay, and they have never been found. So getting rid of Charles took care of one problem, but it didn't stop people from asking where in the hell Charles was. By October 2021, LAPD homicide detective Mark O'Donnell gets a call from a woman who tells him she thinks Charles may already be dead. And she tells him something else. She thinks somebody is using Charles' identity to get his money. So O'Donnell started looking into it. He contacted Caroline. Caroline gave him a number for Charles. It doesn't work. O'Donnell tells her he needs a working number and an address for Charles, or he's opening up a missing person case. The next day, Caroline calls him back. Now she says she's with Charles. She puts the man on the phone, and this man tells O'Donnell he's Charles Wilden. He says he's staying with some friends in Simi Valley. He gives O'Donnell an address and a phone number. O'Donnell asks him for his social security number. He can't give it to him. He asks for his driver's license number. Can't give him that either. So O'Donnell goes to Simi Valley and checks the address. Charles ain't there. The man who actually lived there tells him he knows Charles, but he hasn't seen him in years. So now O'Donnell knows somebody just lied about being Charles. The next day, he and his partner goes over to Caroline's apartment. And while O'Donnell was sitting there talking to her, he still received for a cell phone store sitting there on a coffee table. The phone had just been bought a couple of days earlier. He checked the number on the receipt, same number the fake Charles just gave him. Now he got a phone being used by somebody pretending to be Charles, and that phone leads straight back to Caroline. So O'Donnell keep digging. He started looking at the paperwork Caroline is using to say she has control over Charles' property. One of those documents is a trust. He tracked down a notary whose information is on it. And she tells him she never notarized that document. Her information had been used without her permission. So now this ain't about finding Charles no more. O'Donnell got a missing man nobody could physically produce. He got somebody pretending to be that man. He got a phone connecting the impersonation back to Caroline. And now he got paperwork that appears to be fake. What he doesn't know yet is how much money is involved. So in June of 2022, U.S. Postal Inspector Lyndon Verosa gets involved into the investigation. And Verosa started following the money. That's when you find out Charles wasn't the only person these people had been stealing from. So Verosa started going through the money. Bank records, property records, where money came from, where money went. And while he's doing that, he finds another house. This one is in Encino. It belonged to a man named Robert Taskin. Robert wasn't missing. Robert wasn't dead. Robert was living in Texas, but somehow his house back in Los Angeles had been sold for about $1.5 million, and Robert didn't sell it. Caroline and people working with her had used forged documents to take control of Robert's property. They even had somebody pretend to be Robert using fake identification. Then in September of 2021, they sold his house, about $1.5 million. So now investigators are looking for two different victims. With Charles, the man was dead, but they're pretending he's alive so they can keep getting his money. With Robert, the man is actually alive. They're basically pretending to be him so they could sell his house. Robert had moved to Abilene, Texas with his girlfriend a few years earlier, but that house in Encino still belongs to him. Eventually, Robert finds out what happened. Now he's trying to fight to get his property back. He's dealing with lawyers, he's dealing with litigation. He's trying to untangle something he didn't even create. Then in 2022, Robert died by suicide. He was 53 years old. I'm not gonna sit here and tell y'all the house was the reason Robert took his life, because we don't know that. Robert had a history of mental illness, so there was other things going on in his life. But his girlfriend later told us that everything happened at the house left Robert feeling hopeless. Now Verosa keeps following the $1.5 million, and some of that money from Robert's house ends up being used by Caroline to buy other properties in West Hills. That property was being used for a sober living home. But the more investigators looked at this, the more shit they found. Because now there's another estate involved, more than $1.7 million. And somebody had created a fake will making it look like Charles was supposed to be inheriting that money. Charles, the same man who already was dead, whose body has already been dumped in San Francisco Bay, now his name is being used to put another estate into the scheme. And because Caroline had positioned herself as the person controlling Charles' estate, if that money went to Charles, guess who gets control of it? By the time investigators started adding all this up, the total losses connected to this fraud was almost $3.9 million. Now they know this ain't just somebody stealing mail and draining a bank account. These people are stealing houses, creating fake trusts, creating fake wills, using fake identification, having people to pretend to be property owners, and moving millions of dollars. So in January of 2023, investigators started executing federal search warrants at personal properties connected to Caroline. And what they find gives them a pretty good idea that Charles and Robert might not have been the end of this. They find drugs, heroin, methamphetamines, magic mushrooms. They find fake law enforcement badges, and they find guns, 16 of them. Some were ghost guns with no serial numbers. A number of guns was loaded. Caroline even had a loaded gun inside of her purse. But then they started going through her electronics. And this is where they really start seeing what they were looking at. They find spreadsheets. One tab says heir index. Another says heirs names. Another says current balance. There are property identification numbers in there. Then they look at Caroline internet search, millionaire, obituary, They also find screenshots of Google satellite maps showing different properties in expensive neighborhoods. And some of those houses had swimming pools where the water had turned green. We also believe that was one thing they were looking for. Because if the pool was green and the property looked like nobody took care of it, maybe the house was empty. Maybe nobody's going to notice right away if somebody started messing with the property. Which is pretty much how this whole thing started with Charles. Caroline was arrested when those warrants were executed. Speedy was arrested shortly after. And when investigators searched Speedy's truck, they found documents connected to Charles and his mother June. Then Speedy started talking. He admitted he broke into Charles' house while Charles was alive. He admitted he went back later and found him dead. He admitted he took Charles' mails and financial records, and he admitted he made money from the whole thing. Speedy said his cut was around $140,000. So now investigators got one of the people who was there from the beginning to tell him how everything started. And Caroline was in custody too. They already knew about the money. They know about the fake documents. They know about Robert's house. They know somebody pretended to be Charles. But there are still some things Caroline hasn't told them. And once she started talking, investigators finally get her version of what they did with Charles after he died. So now Caroline's in custody. And when investigators started questioning her, she doesn't come out and tell them everything. But eventually she started talking about Charles. And this is where they finally get her version of what happened to the body. She tells them Charles was moved out of the house in Sherman Oaks. She talks about the chemicals, the rooftop, trying to dissolve the body, how that didn't work, the dismemberment, the vacuum sealing bags, the trip up north, and finally, San Francisco Bay. Now investigators finally know where Charles ended up. The problem is, knowing where somebody's remains were dumped and actually finding them in San Francisco Bay were two completely different things. They searched, they never found Charles. And that created another problem because investigators still didn't know how Charles died. They knew Speedy had broken into his house while Charles was still alive. They knew when Speedy came back, Charles was dead. But Charles had been decomposing before the body was moved. Then they tried to dissolve him. Then he was dismembered. Then his remains were dumped in the bay. So there's no body for medical record examiners to examine. No autopsy. No way for investigators to go back and determine exactly what killed him. And that's why nobody in this case was charged with murder. Not Caroline, not Speedy, not nobody. The federal case was about what could be proved. The fraud, the stolen identity, the forged documents, the property, the money, and what they did to Charles after he was dead. In March of 2023, Caroline pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She admitted being a part of a scheme that used stolen identity and fake documents to take money and property that didn't belong to them. Speedy eventually pleaded guilty too. In October of 2023, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and Speedy had another federal charge on top of all that, possession with intent to distribute methamphetamines. He pleaded guilty to that too. Caroline went to sentencing first, March 15, 2024. By then, the government had put the total losses for this whole fraud scheme at almost $3.9 million. The judge sentenced Caroline to 20 years in federal prison. That was the maximum prison sentence for wire fraud conspiracy charges. She was then ordered to pay nearly $3.9 million in restitution. The judge said something to Caroline during the sentence that pretty much tells you how the court looked at her for doing this to Charles. She said Caroline treated Charles like a cash register, and when you look at it, that's basically what they did. This man died inside his own house. Instead of somebody calling the police, they started looking at what he owned, his money, his house, his financial information, his name. Even if Charles was dead, they were still finding ways to make money off of this man. Now, Speedy's sentencing didn't happen for 2 years after Caroline's. And when his time came, his attorney tried to separate Speedy from what Caroline did. His attorney described Caroline as the mastermind. He said Speedy had originally met her at a courthouse in Van Nuys where she was pretending to be a lawyer. His attorneys claimed Speedy eventually wanted Charles' death reported and had a falling out with Caroline over it. But the judge wasn't letting Speedy act like he just got caught up in something Caroline started. Because go all the way to the beginning. Who found Charles' house? Who broke into Charles' house while he was still alive? Who came back after Charles had died? Who found Charles' body and didn't call the police? And who bought Charles' mail and financial information and brought Caroline into it? Speedy. So the judge told him, you kicked the whole thing off. On 2005, 2026, Speedy was sentenced to 200 months in federal prison. That's 16 years and 8 months. He was also ordered to pay over $1.9 million in restitution. So by 2026, the federal case had pretty much caught up with everybody. Caroline got 20 years, Speedy got 16 years and 8 months. Millions of dollars of restitution had been ordered. But after everything investigators figured out in this case, There was still something they couldn't figure out. What killed Charles Wilding? And I know I say this a couple of times throughout the story, but I think it's important because when you hear everything they did to his body, it's easy to start thinking these people killed him too. We don't know that. Investigators don't know that. Nobody was convicted of killing Charles. What we know is Speedy broke into the house while Charles was alive. He came back later and Charles was dead. And instead of calling somebody, Speedy saw what was in the house and started stealing. Then Caroline gets involved. And from this point on, Charles' death isn't being treated like somebody just died. It became a problem they had to work around. They needed his money, use his name, needed control of his property, make paperwork. Somebody wants to talk to Charles, put somebody else on the phone. Somebody asks what Charles is, Carpinteria, then he's the Simi Valley. And when his body became something they get rid of, they try to dissolve it. When that don't work, they dismember him, package his remains up, vacuum seal him, drive him to Northern California, and dump him in the bay. And Charles is still out there somewhere. His remains had never been recovered. The other thing that gets me about this case is how close they came to making it look like he moved somewhere else. Because Charles already stayed to himself. He didn't have a wife or kids living with him. His mother was gone. People weren't used to seeing a whole bunch of visitors at the house anyway. So when he disappeared, there wasn't somebody walking through that front door the next morning looking for him. But people around him did notice. They started asking questions. Somebody called for that welfare check. Somebody called Detective O'Donnell and told him Charles might be dead and somebody might be using his identity. And that's what finally got the right person looking at it. O'Donnell couldn't find Charles, but he found somebody pretending to be Charles. He found the phone leading back to Caroline. He found problems with the paperwork. Then Verosa followed the money, and they found Robert Taskin, the Encino house, the fake documents, the other estate, almost $3.9 million in losses. All of that came out of people asking one simple question: where is Charles? And they eventually got the answer to almost everything. Where the money went, who took it, who forged the documents, who broke into the house, who helped get rid of his body, where the remains were dumped. But one answer they never got: how did Charles die? And unless somebody who knows something come forward, we might never know.